Thank you for joining us. Please take your seat. The session is about to begin. Please welcome the panel on Strengthening Democracy in the 21st Century, moderated by NBC News political director and moderator of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd.
Oh, yeah, I see. Still working. Yeah, exactly. Now I'm sorting things out.
And one.
Right.
All right. Hello, everybody. We are having the uplifting conversation of democracy. It is not in the best place that it could be. Let me give you a couple of stats to start us off, get you in the mindset of the conversation that we're going to have. Stat number one. For the fifth consecutive year, the number of countries moving in an authoritarian direction exceeds the number of countries moving in a democratic direction. In fact, the number moving in the direction of authoritarianism is 3 times the number moving towards democracy. So that's stat number one. That should scare you. Stat number two, get it here, my apologies. A total of 60 countries suffered declines over the past year, while only 25% improved on democracy. As of today, some 38% of the global population live in what are classified by Freedom House as not free countries. It is the highest proportion in over 25 years. Only about 20% of the globe currently lives in free countries. So, that is where we begin. I've got a terrific panel here from all over the globe. The ambassador from Colombia to the United States, Juan Carlos Pinzon. It's nice to see you, Ambassador, again.
Good to see you, Chuck. Thank you.
We have from Afghanistan, Ambassador Roya, Romani. It's nice to see you. From Michigan, here in the United States, Congressman Peter Meyer. And a journalistic colleague who dabbled in the democracy most recently from the New York Times, Nicholas Kristof. So I think it's a tremendous panel. The person closest to the ballot right now, though, on this panel is the ambassador in his country. And I want to start in Latin America, Ambassador, because we are seeing a slide of sort of we're seeing a move of authoritarianism. We've seen it building. Obviously, Venezuela's the most stark example, but what we've been watching in Brazil, what we saw in Peru, and a democracy that has been very healthy in Colombia. You guys, you were pretty nervous. We talked last week, and you seemed a bit nervous about what was going on. Share it with the audience.
Well, thank you, Chuck. I think that, as you said, and with the numbers you give, the most important thing is not to forget that democracy, we cannot take it for granted. It's a wonderful system, but at the same time, some people are starting to criticize our system for not providing results in the short term. And that's a little bit of where the debate is. But what worries me is that that debate has been taken over mainly by populists that are proposing and promising things that will never happen, but that suddenly, are very attractive to people that somehow is frustrated to see some lack of results from the democratic process and the bureaucratic system that all of us have. I think there are two things or two issues that are important to look to the future. How we become more effective, how we provide more deliverables, that's one thing. But the second, how do we protect democracy from those that are trying to use democracy to take it over? And from what we see in Latin America, what I perceive is that in many of the countries, those who have promoted the idea of populism get through the democratic system, of course, offering things that are not realistic, that are false ideas at the end. But what is worse, once they get there, they start a process of reforming the system to the point of making their stay for a long term and somehow moving into autocracy. I think that's something we need to focus on. Probably along the panel, I will bring some specifics about Latin America, but I wanted to, stage a little bit of the conversation.
Ambassador Romani, it feels as if we gave up on democracy, and I say we, the United States. We gave up on democracy in Afghanistan, didn't we?
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
You did. In fact, when you went in, you did bring democracy. It did work. In 2004, 10 million people went to the polls. 40% of them were women. And then the trend continued over to the parliamentary elections and so forth, and it derailed. And it derailed for the very same reasons that you gave the stats for, that it's derailing all around the world. There is three main themes that I have been observing. It is coercion, which is very clear. We know democracy is coming down in the hands of the men with guns. They push military forces and they take over. There are coups, and it results to the end of the democracies. There has been examples of Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Egypt, and so forth. The other reason is extremism. Extremists usually go to the extremes in order to remain in power. They compromise systems, the very systems that promote democracy, the institutions. They do all, they adapt and assume all sorts of measure, from rewriting the rules and calling it electoral reforms, to the changing, buying or bullying media, to buying parliaments, and you name it. But, and then the third factor is usually the issue that the countries are also compromising the very institutions that they are working to preserve in the time of crisis. So crisis is the third element, and usually it is used to give the leaders the power to issue executive decrees, to make new problems to forget the other ones, to change the system in order to basically address the crisis that is happening. And all in all of these issues have resulted in the stats that you give. So what should happen is to find measures and ways to preserve those institutions, to reinforce them, and ensure that there are means and ways, not only formally, but also informally. And we can talk more about the codes and norms that would sustain that.
Nick, you and I were talking earlier that in some ways, look, I don't think it's a coincidence that this decline in global democracy and global freedom has come with a decline in our country of deciding whether we should export democracy. We had I think there was really no debate about this in the 90s and even in the early aughts right after 9/11. And then Iraq and Afghanistan didn't go well. And we had a robust debate in this country, and we think, well, maybe we can't impose our will on everybody. We can't impose a democracy. And we've kind of been a bit in retreat. And I understand results matter and the way the public matters here. But if we're in retreat globally, it seems that we see the response. That's not a popular thing to do in this country, but do you think the two go hand in hand?
So I think that there was a retreat after 9/11. There was a great interest in the world, and then we overextended, and then there was kind of weariness with the world, and I think we tended to look inward. I do think that what is happening in Ukraine now is reversing that, and we understand with Russia's behavior in the Ukraine that we actually do have a stake, and that the fact that it was Putin who came to power at the end of 1999 rather than many other players who might have come to power then really has made a difference for the US and obviously for Ukraine, it does become harder for the US to project these values and to make a difference at a time when the rest of the world looks to the US and they see democracy in the US, in uncertain shape, and many Americans, not showing great commitment to democracy in our country. And I think that at the end of the day, the most important way we can advance democracy isn't by sending troops abroad, and it's not by the slogans that we send out, but it goes to what Juan Carlos said about making democracy effective in places where it is struggling. And the reason that Putin came to power beginning in 1999 was that under Yeltsin and a democracy, Russian life expectancy for men had fallen 8 years. If we were in that kind of economic crisis, then many of us would support a strong man as well. You see something similar in the Philippines under Duterte, right now in El Salvador under President Bukele, who at least can, he's going to bring gangs to reign. So we have to, I think, understand that when we don't use trade policy, economic policy, vaccination policy to support democracies, then the upshot is that too often democracies fail.
Peter, Nicholas sort of brings up something that is interesting, this trend. In democracies, in whether it's one that's like ours, there has been a tendency to be looking for a strong man, to be slipping towards authoritarianism. Obviously, in the authoritarian systems, they don't like it and they would like to see some democracy. So we are in this weird point where we're moving in opposite directions, and our best small d democratic examples are looking for strongmen. What do you you're on the front lines of this in this country. You're seeing it with why do your voters want to gravitate toward a strongman?
I mean, I think a lot of it comes to what Juan Carlos was saying about that rising populism, overpromising in ways that can never be delivered upon, right? And then if you have cycle after cycle of no matter which side of the aisle it is, they're making promises that can never be fulfilled. They are creating a sense of disillusionment and frustration among their voters. You have a little bit of a horseshoe circling around and saying, well, if it isn't the letter by that person's name, maybe it's the whole system, maybe it's these institutions themselves that are corrupted or that are incapable of giving us what we need. And so then the institution's in the way. It's not the party, it's not who that individual is, it is the institutions that are preventing the promises from being delivered, and you get rid of the institutions and then there's just that one individual. Mm-hmm. And I think that is where you see a uniting of those characteristics. And it's dark, I mean, it's frightening, because it is just a very easy and logical short-circuiting of the way that our complex power, or the balance of powers within our government, the complexity of a federal system. It's a lot easier to say, I alone can fix it, and here's what we're going to do, than to make a very convoluted argument of, well, maybe I alone can fix it if we can obtain the right permissions at each level of government, and then work it through an interagency process before it's delivered to the legislature, and then the courts ratify it. That's very unsatisfying.
Yeah, that's not satisfying. Mm-mm. I'm curious of something, Juan Carlos. It is if you were to pick one thing that has made this more difficult. I know what I would pick, but I don't want to bias the question here. What would you pick? One thing that has made keeping the democracy healthy in Latin America, what is it?
I think there are some few that I will say. Mm-hmm. One is, as I said before, delivery. The second one is corruption. And the third one is impunity. As much as we have impunity for different kinds of crimes in the system, the democratic system begins to crumble and somehow to become less credible. I have that impression there as well. And when I connect these to corruption, of course, that is a little bit in the minds of people. And easily anyone can just claim, we will eliminate corruption. But would you do it really? Can you do it? And that's a little bit of something that I believe has creating this expansion of changes that at the end are bringing more frustration. Because in Latin America, we started that process well ahead. Mm-hmm. We have the Chavez-Maduro case. We have seen recently the case of Ortega in Nicaragua. And Now, and let's face it, this is another thing I believe we will have to have a conversation. The global power competition influence into different regions of the world, including Latin America. There is a proposition of competition between the model of the West and those that are trying to compete.
Basically, China versus the West, right? Yeah, the two.
And of course, that creates a lot of tension, and by the way, a lot of bias from those sectors that were selling the populist idea, those impossible ideas to be executed, but now somehow they have some credibility, some power behind. I think that's important. And not to forget Russia. Russia has played a role by, in the case of Venezuela and Nicaragua, establishing intelligence stations, disinformation capabilities, cyber capabilities that somehow have affected the politics in the region, including the one in my own country that is nowadays part of that. And finally, criminal economies or illegal economies, specifically cocaine business and illegal mining of gold, to be specific. That has been used by some regimes, like the one in Venezuela, to hold on and to keep some level of funding and stability, but that money has been used as well to fund political activities in different parts of the region, and somehow contributing by that to change the trend to more this autocratic logic of power that we've seen.
Royal, why has the United Nations, let me ask you this, do you believe, why has the United Nations not been there to essentially help Afghanistan not slip into where they've slipped? Why isn't the United Nations a helpful ally here?
Well, the real question is that the United Nations mandate to ensure that countries are not slipping? I don't think that is their mandate.
No, it's not. Yeah.
So, and secondly, a lot of the United Nations, in fact, the way it functions is a collection of all those, the bureaucracies of all those countries combined. So it has a very cumbersome bureaucratic process, and as a result, a lot of the resources and funds that are channeled through them does evaporate on the way where it's intended to go. And secondly, like again, to ensure to sustain or maintain a system, it should not be necessarily an outside force, whether it's another country or an agency like that of United Nations, a multilateral organization. It should come or get to that kind of maturity that it has to be enshrined within the country. And there was the opportunity in the case of Afghanistan that it could have happened should other measures been in place. What are those measures? Accountability. The world just took a blind eye in the level of corruption and accountability, in the way the stability was continuously, democracy was continuously compromised under the term of stability, which wasn't necessarily stability. It was just giving way to derailing it. And then on the other hand, working under a timeline. Like, while this is a very complex regional situation, the rest of the world got tired.
Yeah.
And then they said, okay, so now it is time to leave. So it went back to the very popular saying of the Taliban that you have all the watches, they had all the time.
Right.
So this is where we are.
So, Nicholas, where I was getting at, when Juan Carlos mentioned corruption, and in some ways Roy's mentioning corruption as well, there's a weaponization of it, and it's been weaponized by our basically the information. I think about 2011 and how much we thought social media was going to spread democracy, and now social media looks like it's the greatest tool an authoritarian could have ever invented.
One of the, I was among those who thought that
Me too.
Facebook was going to help.
I'm with you, buddy.
Bring democracy. And I remember in covering the the genocide against the Rohingya in Myanmar and going to a village where the Rohingya had been massacred and talking to the Rakhine people who were committing some of these massacres and asking them how this happened. And they said, well, you know, we read these Facebook messages about how Rohingya had supposedly raped some Rakhine woman, and, you know, and then it went from there. And I think that the larger question is that, you know, we were talking about democracy here, and democracy is the thing we value. But when we say democracy, we don't just mean majority voting. We don't just mean democracy in a narrow sense. We mean some broader sense of civil society that also addresses corruption, that also addresses minority rights, that also provides for freedom of speech and of the press. And I think that too often we've elided that distinction. And so, you know, in India right now, we see a populist democratic government that may be gaining votes by persecuting Muslims. In Pakistan, conversely, we see democratic governments that may gain votes by persecuting Ahmadis or Christians. And so what we want to promote is democracy in this broader sense of a government that provides a broader civil society that is effective and maybe above all that protects minority rights. And that's not just about guaranteeing free elections, but about something much harder and more complex to provide.
Peter, you're not just a member of Congress, you served, so you were in, I think Nicholas was bragging, this is the only panel with 2 people who've spent time in South Sudan that we have today. You were in Afghanistan, you saw firsthand. Should America be the exporter of democracy? Should we be doing this? You were on the front lines of helping export it. Should we be?
No, and I went in, so I deployed to Iraq 2010, 2011. I've had the rare distinction of closing out 2 of our wars coming in post-withdrawal as a civilian in Afghanistan and as a soldier in Iraq. And I very much believed in our project in Iraq when I went in, because it was that thought of if there's so much positive energy, if there's so much, you know, will and might, we should be able to get something done here that's good. And there were some positive things that were accomplished, but you know, in getting to what Roya was saying, I mean, it's that tension between stability and democracy. And where do you make concessions in the short term? In Afghanistan, plenty of concessions made for their counter-narcotics mission, for the counter-terrorism mission, that ultimately maybe drove some of the military objectives, but at the expense of any of our longer-term governance missions that we had. In Iraq, you know, we were continuously aligning ourselves with unsavory actors one day to go after our enemy du jour, and then we'd be aligning ourselves with that enemy the next to go after our former allies. And it was all a very less than productive exercise. And that's one of the challenges when we are inherently involving ourselves in a civil war that then orients its contours to take in our involvement, and we kind of ping pong between which side we support. So my answer isn't a no, but it's we have to go in with a sense of humility and also recognizing something will be a long-term project. If you want to get something done on the cheap, you're going to cut corners, you're going to buy your own propaganda, you're going to find allies of convenience that will ultimately maybe not be invested over the duration of the mission you're planning on. And so you have to go in understanding and committing over the long haul rather than trying to do something quick, fast, cheap, and then always end up paying more.
Roy, I'm curious, when you see how much America is devoting its resources to helping Ukraine, how does that make you feel about us walking away from Afghanistan?
Frankly speaking, sometimes I wonder if it's a matter of time. You were devoting a lot of resources to Afghanistan at one point too. But of course, there is a difference in motivation. It is an invasion and aggression by an outsider, while the reason to intervene in Afghanistan was very different. So that's really the crux of it. And then it's not any invader that is going to Ukraine. It is very clear what is happening, and it has the whole dynamic, the forces that is threatening NATO, and this is why all the NATO allies are really shrinking and like tightening up and rethinking their whole budgetary system that we are witnessing. So it is very different, but in terms of the treatment and outlook, of course there is an element of proximity to sort of culture, if I put it mildly.
We seem to be we selectively care about which democracies we want to save.
It was, yeah, and that I wouldn't necessarily say it has been something new. Not only that, but also you select whether to help or not, or whether to reform or not, because there are countries that are not democratic, and you're fine with them because you find partnership and go along, get along with. But then there are those that you cannot deal with them, right, and you would like to reform them. But let me add something here. In the case of Afghanistan, there was an opportunity for it to be a success story, and it was going to that direction. There were some basic fundamental flaws that were happening, and that was not necessarily unique to Afghanistan, but it keeps repeating. And one of it was the system that you were exporting. The system of separation of power, the presidential system with 2 terms election, which we copied your constitution and the system of it, but our culture was not ready for that. What was that culture? I'm not talking about tribalism or anything, but I'm talking about a culture of war that have been really present there for so long. So it was more prone for the leaders to hold on to power at any price. So my suggestion was, of course, I wasn't in Bonn to say, or I didn't have any influence, right, to say do it differently, but the president should have had 1 term, probably a longer term, but absolutely 1 term, with no extension. The same thing, for example, happened in Argentina when they copied your constitution, 2/3 of it, in fact, and then next round, there was a coup, and it fell apart. So copying the same thing does not necessarily, or is going to succeed and go the same way, not recognizing the situation and the reality on the ground and the cultural support for the norms that would sustain that.
Let me ask this, in hearing you talk about it, should it have even been a presidential model? Should it have been a total parliamentary system that Afghanistan should have been set up with, to bring in the various tribal leaders sort of feeling as if they had some stake in it?
I'm not going to advocate for the past that it should have been a parliamentary system, because one of the things that democracy took to people was hope. And if it was, for example, a fully parliamentary system, you would have already probably taken some of that hope away for people to see all the very people that they violated them, that they fired missiles at them, that they looted their houses, are now coming as the members of parliament, which they did anyways later on.
Right.
But the system of the presidential is not the problem. I think the fact that it was 2 terms and expecting it to succeed in the absence of, like, absolute absence of institutions, I would say, was, in my view, the biggest mistake.
Juan Carlos, America's relationship with Latin America is not great. And I think part of the, we got involved in very manipulative ways in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And now we've just been in retreat. We support Colombia because, frankly, you guys have wanted to be a small d democratic system. How would you advise the United States to be a better exporter of democracy to Latin America?
Well, first, you said something that I should start with. The relationship between Colombia and the United States is a very special one. This year, we're celebrating 200 years of relationship. And we, in Colombia, have a very high regard for the support that the United States has provided to Colombia, especially in the past 20 years, where we were at the verge of being a failed state, according to some experts, and today somehow we're the oasis of democracy and freedom. And
Would you have done it without the U.S.'s help? quietly, covertly, militarily? Would Colombia be in the position it is in today?
I think U.S. effort was extremely important, and I think the way it happened is an example probably to the future, in the sense that it happened in a way in which we did the job, but we got a friend that support us with some tools. What I see is going on in Ukraine, total different comparison, total different world, but somehow it's a little bit what I see. Are the Ukrainians that are fighting for their life, for their freedom, for their country, for their democracy, but they now have real powerful friends that can provide them technology, tools, and some techniques to be effective. That's a little bit what was the model of Plan Colombia as it was. Now, still we haven't finished the problem. Otherwise, we wouldn't be discussing on the risk of democracy and how populism raised back and how the setup of the Havana Agreement somehow created the idea of impunity, and some of them now are competing to really get to power and recreating a narrative in a country like Colombia. So the question is, what should be done from the US perspective in order to continue to support the idea of democracy and really let us all be more effective? The first idea, and this is why I feel always very happy to come to a place like Milken, is prosperity. That's the first one. And I said a lot about deliverables, but that's the most important one. If we can attract investment, if we can attract education, technology, and somehow our people can enhance their life of quality, and by the way, we reduce slowly but steadily inequality, and most important inequality is having access to opportunities, somehow that creates a wonderful environment. Now, my permanent recommendation to my friends here in the United States is watch Latin America with more passion. Yeah. Fall in love with our region. You here usually have fallen in love with our music, with our culture, with our food, but you haven't fallen in love with the opportunity of Latin America. We're a region that is fully endowed of water, natural resources, and 1 billion people that is young, that somehow is the same time zone, and that somehow, if you give them opportunities, they will be fully connected to this, continent of democracy. But if we don't do that, we're going to get poisoned by other ideas, by all ideas of Marxism that now they are reframing. They are taking opportunity of lack of effectiveness, and somehow they're succeeding in getting to power with a lot of concern for the good of the region, but somehow for the United States.
Well, because they can always point to the fact that the United States always walks away.
That's it.
And with Latin America, every president I've ever dealt with, it's always the second-term agenda. Oh, in the second term, we're going to try to figure out the Western Hemisphere. In the second term, we're going to I grew up in the capital of Latin America. I grew up in Miami. So this is very personal to me, and it's such a missed opportunity economically. I mean, the fact that we have not created a Western Hemisphere as sort of a powerful economic engine is on us. Nicholas, there's an interesting pattern that is developed that when I'm watching our democracy, I want to talk about the US democracy in a minute, because you look at Turkey's elections, and nobody in Istanbul wanted to vote for Erdogan. In fact, his party lost the mayor's race and all that stuff in Istanbul. But you go farther out into rural Turkey, and Erdogan had a big following. Well, that's an interesting pattern. And it's just like we are falling into the same pattern where the educated elites are on one side, and the working class and those that either can't get a better education or have chosen not to are on the other side. We don't look any different than any other fledgling democracy around the world right now.
I think that's a challenge for the US. So I came here from my home in rural Oregon, which is a place that is really struggling. More than a quarter of the kids on my old school bus are now dead from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. And this is a problem in rural America that the American political system, Democrats and Republicans alike, have completely failed to address. We're now losing about 200...
The prosperity argument that Juan Carlos just made has not come to rural America.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're in the US, we're losing about 250,000 Americans a year from drugs and alcohol. combined. And we don't have policies that affect it. They don't get the attention they deserve. And I think that that is part of the breakdown in democracy in rural America. I have two friends who live not far from me in rural Oregon who both talk about taking up arms against the government in ways that are scary. And I wish that the result were more of a competition between Democrats and Republicans alike for some of these working class voters, but you see hints of that, but not very much in terms of actual policies that would make a difference. And I don't see much sign that those kinds of alienated voters, rural voters, working class voters, feel any greater stake in the system.
Peter, I mean, just listening to Juan Carlos and listening to others that I've talked to about what we're seeing in Latin America, what you see in Turkey, what we see in these democracies that are slipping, the pattern is awfully similar. A bunch of people feel like the prosperity hasn't been shared with them.
Well, partially on the prosperity side, though, I think there's some innate human psychology coming in, right? That sense of loss aversion. If you go from 20 to 100, and then you go from 100 down to 90, you feel the decrease from 100 to 90 a lot more than you felt the increase from 20 to 100. So part of it is the challenge of dealing with the economic growth and the prosperity that we saw in the post-World War II period, right? It's going to be very hard for the U.S. to replicate the conditions that gave rise to our middle class. It's going to be very hard for us to replicate, and by God, I hope we don't replicate a condition where we had essentially the only major economy in the world that wasn't destroyed by global conflict. And we were in a fantastic position to export, to rebuild, and we had a population that reaped the benefits of that. Now to try to sustain that trajectory is going to be very challenging. I mean, I think frankly, China is going to be facing a lot of those same problems, but in a far more acute way, because in China, and we're seeing this with the lockdowns, the assumption is under an authoritarian government that you are exporting your agency to that government and you are trusting for it to make those decisions for you. And then you have nobody to blame but the government if they are not able to achieve those. But within our domestic context, it is partially the prosperity, but I think a lot of it is also a crisis of meaning in our country that government is not well situated to provide somebody. I mean, the decline in close male friendships, the decline in religious affiliation or church attendance, the decline in participation in civic or social organizations, I think all of that, if you switch your sense of meaning, and this was my biggest fear during the pandemic, get churches open, get sporting events open, because if politics becomes both a feeling and a meaning of identity and a sense of entertainment and an enjoyment and satisfaction, we see what that leads to. We see what happens when you forswear any of those innate human personal conversations that will be suffused with complexity, and you just get into a like, unlike, retweet. I am blanking on adjectives, and I'm grateful I am because of how little time I spend on social media, but the way in which that has become a sense of meaning, identity, and significance in lives, I think feeds into what's easy to manipulate, what's easy for an autocrat to take advantage of, and then any feeling of grievance can not just feeling like it's being heard, but then being weaponized towards political effect.
Is this what China's effectively using against us, and why they're able to essentially create a transactional relationship with countries where we want a transactional relationship, but we would say, we'll give you more if you open this, and we'll give you, China's not doing any of that. And is that suddenly a disadvantage for us?
I think the biggest disadvantage is what China says will probably be their policy for 2 decades, and what the US says could be reversed in a matter of months if the polling changes. Now, on the flip side, some people want to do business with the U.S. over China because we actually believe and we care, and there's a non-trivial benefit to that. That if nobody wants to feel like everything is purely transactional, and if it's purely transactional, as soon as the calculus changes and it's no longer in the rational interest of the solely transactional individual, they'll cut and run. I mean, the U.S., as we have seen, is willing to stay on long past the point of rationality because we invest ourselves emotionally as a country in what's happening. And so that, that soft sell, I think, is also very strong.
the appeal of China's transactional nature, Juan Carlos, you're watching it in Latin America, right? They're putting in a lot of investments with not such friendly governments.
Well, I think they have become more sophisticated, and that's something I like to tell many people. I think that depending on the country they go, they play with the rules of the land, to put it in perspective. Yes, at the beginning, what we learned from Africa and in some cases in Latin America was more a G2G relationship, and of course a very, very difficult one at the end. But what I have perceived in the past 5 years is more and more companies coming from China with the same presentation as any Western company. They're learning from it. I'm not saying they're equal. I'm not saying they play the same logic long term, but they are precisely presenting as competitive investors. And that's where I think the response needs to be very sophisticated in terms of really allowing American companies, Western companies to really compete on the same basis, probably about cost. You know, the subsidy coming from government in that part of the world is totally different to market competition that we have here. But if American companies and Western companies really want to have a foothold in certain industries, there are tools that need to be developed in a way that we can work. Now, on the other hand, I believe that those countries, like my country as of today, that strongly believe in the importance of having access to the whole international community to really have a multilateral agenda and really benefit from investment and knowledge that is pouring in any part of the world, we need also to be very realistic on how to protect our institutions from external intervention and from manipulation. And that's where we need to set up some level rules. My final point onto this is something that I believe is, requires a total different panel and a full day: social media and democracy. And that's something that I believe we need to watch. If you look every authoritarian...
How destructive do you think social media is in Colombia's politics right now?
A lot. Yeah. A lot. It's disrupting politics, no doubt, and it has polarized the country in a way I've never saw. Until I came back to the United States for my second tour as ambassador, and suddenly I found that those who were friends here are not talking anymore. That, the distance is very much coming out of that social media space. Look,
we're not unique?
We're not unique. All democracies are suffering the same. And this is the argument. Most of authoritarian regimes are controlling access from citizens to social media. Do I agree with that? Of course I don't. There's no way we can agree with that. But when social media came, was a big opportunity to democratize our world. Everybody has a say, everybody is equal, you can be there and you can be in that space. Until disinformation, manipulation, fake news somehow have taken over in many cases, and that has biased the public opinion in different ways. I think that's a discussion that needs to be done, and I think that's very much connected to the numbers you gave initially, where many countries are moving to different things than democracy.
Roya, would you say the social media is causing these kind of problems in Afghanistan, or is it a different situation there?
It definitely contributed a lot. It not only contributed to the situation in terms of, or worsening the situation in terms of democracy, but also in terms of how people are treating one another, how the trust continuously deteriorates among people, the trust between people and the government. In fact, it played an extremely negative role in that context. On the other hand, it has been also the only outlet for people to express themselves. Now that there is no connectivity, that the journalists don't go there is no reporting, the only means for people to let the world know what's happening, or even their families know, is, again, social media. So it can play really a double role, but in terms of the politics, and it did play a very negative role. And I agree with what Carlos was saying. It just exacerbates polarization, which is very dangerous. Polarization, usually it appears if there is socio-economic differences and religious and racial and whatnot, and we see it all over the world. But then this social media has been specifically used to exacerbate this, to the point, again, as Carlos mentioned, that it is not that different parties are simply disagreeing with one another, but they are trying or adapting a policy of being mutually exclusive and defining the other side as a threat. And that is what's dangerous, because it's basically killing the other partner, that there is no further this game of democracy going on. Because the democracy, in a sense, is a game that you can disqualify your opponent, but not kill it,
Right.
so that it can continue. But if the opponent is framed as a threat, then the democracy dies.
Well, we're dehumanizing our opponents in this country a lot. Let me ask you the question about China and China investment and China's support of the Taliban. They don't, they're very transactional.
Right.
What are you hearing and seeing right now with China's influence in Afghanistan?
Well, China is continuing to act the same way that they did. They even demonstrating a little bit to be closer to the Taliban. The main difference for Chinese and many other countries is that with the previous government, they could just ask them to do things in return of other things. Taliban are a little different. They can't work like that necessarily. But they do move forward transactionally. They are one of the countries that they accepted Taliban's diplomat, and they had accepted the Afghan embassy in China to be occupied by the representatives of the Taliban. And they are back and forth in Afghanistan. In fact, Wang Yi's travel to Afghanistan was quite something. Like he had Taliban over, and within the 2 weeks he had a trip several weeks ago back to Afghanistan. But the way I see it is probably less for the transactions and more for their concern and worry, because they are also very cognizant of the potential threat of spread of extremism that can emanate from Afghanistan. They are very nervous about it.
Right.
So this is what defines their relationship. So it's a pull and push, and they want to make sure that they keep them in an arm's length to ensure that no big threat is facing them through the Xinjiang region.
Peter, I get nervous. The 45-year, I have this theory that America's natural state is polarization. If you actually extract the 45 years of the Cold War out, 1880 America, 2022 America, 1840 America, 1925 America. I mean, we can go, it all looks more the same than different. The difference is the 45 years of the Cold War. That's when we trusted journalism the most. Like and it was the least partisan, if you will, or perceived to be partisan, was during that 45-year period. We were the most, you could argue that both parties were at their most moderate in that 45-year period. And I now look at it, it may have been an outlier, and maybe this is our natural state. What do you make of it? It's something that's been a concern, and I've watched with the war in Ukraine, I'm seeing green shoots of that moderation come back. And I'm not saying, boy, we need global war in order to fix our politics and have people be able to see clearly, oh, black, white. Yeah, we need to be on the side of good versus evil.
I mean, in many ways, that becomes a centering and focusing and sobering component, right? I mean, I think I saw this quite clearly. If we have our petty disagreements and squabbles, and then you see the horrors being perpetrated by Vladimir Putin and his forces in Ukraine, Now, sadly, those similar horrors are being perpetrated in Syria by Bashar al-Assad against the people. Similar horrors have been perpetrated throughout parts of Africa against the Tigrayan people in Ethiopia.
No, we've decided to care about Ukraine. Right. No, you're not wrong.
It is a sad but natural human impulse to, the more you could relate to somebody's position, right? And so a sort of middle-income country in Europe it feels more proximate, but let alone you have that general idea of just the perspective that something is put in. It's kind of like being you almost get in a car accident, you kind of stop and refocus, and the things you took for granted, you maybe have a little bit more of an appreciation for. So there is that positive centering, but I will say even during the Cold War, I mean, you had the rise of McCarthyism. Yeah. Right, so you had things may have been pretty black or white, but then anything in the middle, or your political opponents, you tried to shove them into.
But we snuffed it out.
And you also had the rise of during the anti-war movement. I mean, the amount of
very violent left. No, there was a violent left
throughout the country. And I say that more to try to put our current moment in some degree of historical context, because it always feels the worst when you're living it. Right, and as somebody who gets death threats, sees and experiences a lot of that vitriol, it is always helpful to be able to reach back and say, we've been in very dark times.
You haven't been caned yet on the floor of Congress.
No, they.
But don't think.
I'm sure somebody might try to get past
preparing for the caning.
But yeah, exactly.
Nick, what? The other thing that I wonder about is. And how much have we weakened global democracy with our own transactional needs when it comes to our foreign policy over decades? It has created the distrust in Latin America, for instance, I think, because we dealt with many of those countries transactionally vis-a-vis the Cold War rather than vis-a-vis freedom and not freedom in those places.
So there's clearly a transactional quality. There's clearly an inconsistency that we've discussed earlier. I mean, one looks at our relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is certainly one of the least democratic countries around, which kidnapped the prime minister of Lebanon, has presided over the greatest humanitarian crisis in the world in Yemen, et cetera, and without providing accountability there, and yet we're all over other countries. So I do think that those impede our efforts to promote democracy. But I think, maybe even more than that, the way we influence democracy abroad has less to do with our outward policies and more to do with the model that we present. And why is China gaining ground? It's because countries around the world see it and see the economic growth rates in Beijing, and they see China building one new university a week for 20 years now, and they look at the US with 1 in 7 kids still not graduating from high school. They see that a child born in Beijing today has a higher life expectancy than a baby born in Washington, D.C. And I think that undermines the power of our ability to project democracy, and that if we want to stand up to China, that's not just about arming Taiwan, and that's not just about constraining intellectual property violations by China, but it also has to be about raising our high school graduation rate, about addressing deaths of despair in the US, and so on and so on.
Saudi Arabia is an interesting test case because this is the first administration that has basically decided not to try to have a good relationship with Saudi Arabia in my lifetime. And we're paying a price at the pump. It is an interest, and and Venezuela is another. I want to talk about that in a minute. On a small d democratic basis, that's the right call. It's going to look like bad politics, though, for Joe Biden here in the moment, right? Where a Donald Trump who's willing to be a transactional guy all over, there becomes appeal to the transactional when you see something like that. So anyway, I'm curious of what your thoughts are on watching how we're not punishing Saudi Arabia, but we're actually not rewarding them for the first time as an administration in a couple of decades.
Push back a little bit at the implication of the question, because precisely we are, the Biden administration has been trying to take a halfway course, that they have not been punishing them. And I think that has still left Saudi Arabia with a perception that they are in the driver's seat of this relationship, and that they can not respond to our requests on oil production, for example, and that's fine, and that we will still provide weapons.
Yeah, I don't understand why we're not punishing them for not, they've taken a side in this war. They claim they haven't, but by not pumping oil, they've taken a side against Europe and against the West and against the United States, and there doesn't seem to be, so on one hand, we're not having good relations with them, but you're right, we're not punishing them for these decisions either.
But I think we could make clear, Saudi Arabia fundamentally depends for its security on the United States. And Saudi Arabia is concerned about Iran. That is going to come not from the weapons that we provide Saudi Arabia, but from the implicit security guarantee that comes with those weapons. And when the Biden administration says, look, we're fundamentally okay with MBS succeeding from King Salman, then I think that has undermined our leverage and our credibility with that relationship. I think if we were willing to press Saudi Arabia more, we would actually be able to extract more from Saudi Arabia.
Peter, you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's in our best interest to not make Saudi Arabia feel like they need to pursue a nuclear weapons program or to buy a nuke from Pakistan. I very much worry that, if we, on the one hand, it's understandable to want to reevaluate the dynamics that have underpinned our Middle East relations for the longest time, and that's specifically the GCC states against, Iran and the Iranian kind of outgrowth into the Shia Crescent. At the same time, I do think, and going back to that analogy earlier, we're never purely transactional. The Biden administration, they wanted to, have a little bit of the punishment and sort of the moral, like tisk. We're still angry about Khashoggi, and we felt that was never really properly adjudicated in the International Court of Opinion. On the other hand, now we are seeing oil pricing spike, so please, will you sell it to us? So I think it's all in the eye of the beholder, but at the same time, we're going around, and I felt this from many of our GCC countries, just this sense of frustration that we're negotiating with the Iranians when there's not a lot they can really offer it on it, and it was sort of a weird bank shot for Mideast peace, and what is the real aspiration here? And the most concrete thing that it produced was a strong degree of suspicion and paranoia on behalf of countries that say, as soon as the US doesn't need us, they're just going to leave us behind. And then what is going to be that following consequence, rather than, again, saying, how do we keep engagement, have an honest and trusting relationship? Because when you have a good relationship, maybe you don't trash somebody in public, but behind closed doors, you can have a hard conversation. But if you don't, egos get in the way very quickly.
Roya, what does America's relationship with Saudi Arabia look like in Afghanistan?
I would say in general, people, including the leaders, have been somewhat oblivious to it, because they see the two in very, very different roles. So there is the US, who was going there or always had a determining role of how things go and flow. And then there is Saudi, that their biggest role has been ideological, where the basis of people who have religious tendencies or they run on that platform would look at. So it's two very different actors or players, and never necessarily put together or factored in what was going on. In fact, Saudi never played the role that they could have in terms of stability and security.
I feel like they used Afghanistan as their own relief valve, to let their fundamentalists play with the fundamentalists in Afghanistan, to keep, because they're worried about extremism in their own country.
Yes, and also as a backyard for their own ideological differences, the one they have with the Iranians. So the whole game, regional game going on continuously, whether it was between Saudi and Iran, or whether it was Pakistan and India, or Russia and US, it has been always played in the playground, yes, and Saudi was no exception.
Juan Carlos, what was the reaction in Colombia when the US made this brief attempt with Venezuela about 6 weeks ago, when it was, obviously it became politically unpopular in America to do it, but there was going to be this attempt to see if there was some rapprochement that could be made, basically just to increase some oil. I mean, it was a very cynical ploy, but it was for those reasons.
Well, that's an important question, no doubt, you know. And what I will tell you about is, first, I think we understand the need of finding different ways to finally bring back democracy to Venezuela. But that needs to be the real headline. Is bring back democracy of Venezuela, not empower the bad guys that have been doing terrible things.
Or
to their own
essentially
people.
weaponizing energy.
Right.
Yeah.
So what is important is, okay, negotiations or different means are necessary and useful, but let's make sure we have the clear objective. And I think that was our main conversation and discussion, which, by the way, what has happened in Venezuela has been the destruction of the capability of the country that has the greatest reserves on earth in oil. And what we did offer, understanding what is going on in the world and trying to be helpful to the Biden administration and to the United States, was countries like Colombia can even increase the production of oil and energy to support the world markets right now. So let's do it between those of us who are like-minded in terms of believing in democracy, in freedom, free markets, and of course, human rights.
All right, we have 1 minute. We're flashing. Give me one thing to be optimistic about global democracy. Nick, I'll start with you.
Globally, women have gained greater education and more influence in societies, and there's some indication over time that societies in which women have a greater role become less violent, more democratic.
Well, it's directly correlated, isn't it?
Indirectly
More so,
correlated.
yeah. No, but when the rise of women in society seems to bring about some democracy. Peter?
The younger generation. I think a lot of those folks who are growing up,
You say that hopefully or in
I
desperation?
say that hopefully.
Okay.
Well, I mean,
I'm a little
we need
desperate in saying it. Gen Z, your only hope, you know, sort of the Princess Leia moment. Help us, Gen Z, your only hope.
yeah, but frankly, I mean, they get a bad rap sometimes, but frankly, I've seen so many folks who they're paying acute attention to the failures of older generations.
Roya, give me something to be optimistic about.
Better distribution of resources and bring up your gender equality index. That's the key. Put more people in rose color here. It's reference to what photographer was saying.
Yes, well done. Juan Carlos, give me something to be optimistic about.
Well, democracy continues to be the source of freedom, culture, music, art, and technological innovation. And if we don't continue to see that as the real option and the opportunity to a best future, I think we will be missing a big point and the world will be more frustrated.
The thing I loved about this panel is it's a reminder, you know, we used to use that term American exceptionalism a lot. Well, we're not accepted from any of the problems around the world. We've both exported and imported many of them. But the beauty of this panel, I think we all see that this fight for democracy is, and the fight to sort of keep it healthy, there's a lot of similarities in the problems we're all dealing with all around the world. So this is a terrific panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.